I thought the strange man in the grocery store was just another tired stranger passing through town. I thought the truck parked on my land was just someone sleeping for the night. I thought the shadow in my hallway was my imagination playing tricks on me. I was wrong about all of it, because the man from the store had followed me home, and he was already inside my house. I live in northern Utah, right on the edge of a small highway town. There isn't much out here, just a few gas stations, truck stops, small motels, and a handful of stores clustered along the main highway. Once you leave the pavement, the roads quickly turn to dirt, stretching out towards scattered homes, wide open fields, and large private sections of forest and land. Most days are quiet, predictable. I work remotely from home, and that evening I finished up around 6. After shutting down my computer, I drove into town to grab groceries and a few things for the house. Even though it's a highway town, the traffic is usually light, and the stores are rarely crowded. The shopping itself was normal, until I noticed someone watching me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed we just accidentally made eye contact at the same moment. It happens, but a few minutes later, in a different aisle, I saw him again. He walked into the same aisle I was in, even though the rest of the store was mostly empty, and stopped about 5 or 6 feet away from me. I kept pretending to browse, but out of the corner of my eye, I could tell he wasn't reaching for anything. He wasn't moving at all. He was just standing there, watching me. I shifted my gaze slightly so I could see him better without turning my head. I could clearly tell his eyes were locked on me. It made my skin crawl. I finally said, "Hey," trying to keep things casual. He didn't respond. Not a word, not even a nod. I grabbed what I needed and left the aisle as quickly as I could, telling myself he was probably just some strange guy passing through town. Maybe a tired trucker. Maybe someone distracted. I didn't want to overthink it. I checked out and headed back to my car. I usually park toward the back of the lot, and that night was no different. As I tossed the groceries into my trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, I scanned the lot. There were maybe 30 or 40 cars scattered around, but something immediately felt wrong. I saw him again. He was standing between 2 parked cars, staring directly toward me. He didn't have any groceries in his hands. It didn't look like he'd bought anything at all. That uneasy feeling tightened in my stomach. I pulled out of the lot and headed home, trying to shake the encounter from my mind. By the time I reached my property, the sun had mostly set. The dirt roads were dark and quiet, lit only by my headlights. I parked out front and carried the first few bags of groceries inside. While putting things away, I got distracted by a phone call from my dad. A few minutes passed before I remembered the rest of the groceries still sitting in my car. When I stepped back outside, something caught my eye. It took a moment for my vision to adjust to the darkness, but off to the side of the dirt road, far out in the field, I could see the silhouette of a truck. Its lights were completely off. I own just under 40 acres of land. That truck was definitely on my property. It hadn't been there when I drove home. And if someone had simply pulled over to turn around or got lost, why would they park in the field with no lights on? I slowly walked to my car, keeping my eyes locked on the dark shape of the truck the entire time. The only explanation I could come up with was that maybe someone had pulled off the highway to sleep instead of paying for a motel. Even though it was on my land, I didn't want to confront anyone. You never know who might be inside a vehicle like that or what they're capable of. I went back inside and closed the door. Out of caution, I pulled the curtains open slightly so I could keep an eye on the field. Over the next hour, my nerves slowly settled. The truck never moved. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was harmless. I closed the curtains, headed upstairs, and went to bed. Sometime later, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. Still half asleep, I stepped into the hallway. That's when I heard it. A creak, downstairs. I froze. I'd never heard the floors creak like that before. I waited, listening carefully. then slowly closed and reopened the bedroom door to see if the sound repeated. It didn't. I walked to the end of the hallway and peered down the stairs. The lower floor was mostly dark, with only faint moonlight coming through the kitchen windows. That's when I noticed something moving, a shadow. It shifted slightly along the hallway wall downstairs, slow, subtle movement. I couldn't tell if it was inside the house or maybe outside near the back door, casting a strange reflection, but my heart immediately started pounding. I didn't hesitate. I quietly backed into my bedroom, closing the door as gently as possible, trying not to make a sound. Then I called the police. I kept my voice low as I explained what I was seeing. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The house remained silent. I started to wonder if I'd imagined it. Then I heard it again. Slow, careful footsteps moving across the floor below me. The sound drifted toward the living room. My blood ran cold. A minute later, flashing lights appeared outside as a police car pulled up. Suddenly, there was frantic movement downstairs, hurried footsteps scrambling toward the exit. The officers rushed in. They caught him running back toward the truck parked in the field. And when I saw his face under the flashing lights, my stomach dropped. It was the man from the grocery store. He had followed me. He had broken into my home. Even worse, he was armed. He claimed he was only trying to rob me, but nothing about the situation felt random. He hadn't taken anything. He didn't even bring a bag. He knew I was home. He'd likely been watching my house for hours, watching me, waiting. What he truly planned to do is something I don't even want to imagine. Next story. I thought the man knocking on my cabin door in the middle of the woods was the host. He smiled. He sounded friendly. He acted like everything was completely normal. But when he came back a second time, then suddenly disappeared from the doorway, and I saw his eyes staring at me through the window. I realized something was terribly wrong. That man was never the owner of that cabin. Last summer, I was driving home after visiting several relatives. I had taken a longer route than usual, breaking the trip into multiple days, driving about 4 hours each day. This night was my final stop before finishing the drive home. Everything ahead of me was nothing but empty forest. There technically was another city I could have stopped in, but it was too far off my route to justify the extra time. Instead, I booked a small Airbnb cabin about 2 hours away, directly along the way. It felt safer and more comfortable than staying at some random roadside motel. The landscape was mostly flat, with long stretches of trees scattered across open land. When I pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was a row of tall pine trees planted perfectly in a straight line across the front of the property, with a gravel driveway cutting through the middle. The whole setup looked oddly staged and a little unsettling. I parked and unlocked the padlock using the code the host had emailed me. Inside, the cabin looked freshly renovated. It was small but clean, modern, and surprisingly cozy. Since I was only staying for the night, I didn't bother unpacking much. I sat at the table and ate a quick meal I'd picked up from a drive-thru on the way. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It startled me because I hadn't heard a car pull up or any footsteps outside. I got up and opened the door. A man stood there. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a shaved head and a thick gray-black beard. He smiled and said, "Just stopping by to make sure you got in okay and everything looks good." Assuming he was the host, I told him everything was fine and thanked him. We exchanged quick goodbyes, and I closed the door. Something about it felt slightly off, though. It was strange that he showed up unannounced instead of texting or calling. He also had a strong odor on him, like he'd been working outside all day in dirt or fields. I brushed it off and went back to my meal. After eating, I took a quick shower and got into bed, scrolling on my phone for a few minutes. Then there was another knock. This time, my stomach tightened immediately. Again, I hadn't heard a car. No footsteps, just sudden knocking. Why would the host come back so quickly? I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. I walked slowly toward the door as the knocking continued. Instead of opening it, I called out through the door and asked what he needed. The knocking stopped. Several seconds passed. Silence. Then he knocked again and asked if I could open the door. I told him it was late and that unless there was an emergency, I'd prefer to be left alone. The silence afterward stretched far too long. I waited, listening, expecting to hear footsteps walking away on the gravel. Nothing. I carefully stepped closer to the door and looked through the small window. No one was there. My heart started pounding. There was no way he could have walked away without making noise. Gravel was loud underfoot. So where did he go? I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what was happening. Then I glanced toward one of the living room windows. Two eyes were staring directly at me from outside. Pure panic took over. I ran straight to the bedroom and called 911. While I waited for dispatch, I could hear someone trying to lift the window frame. That's when the realization hit me. If he was really the host, he would have had a key. He wouldn't need to sneak through windows. When police arrived, the man was already gone. Officers contacted the actual owner of the cabin. The man who knocked on my door was not the host. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, but I know one thing for certain. If I had opened that door the second time, this story might have ended very differently. Next story. We thought spring break would be quiet and peaceful. Just a small cabin in the woods, far away from the city. No neighbors, no traffic, no noise. Until something deep in the forest made a sound that didn't belong there. And later that night, a man showed up at our door, holding an axe. It was spring break. I was 18 at the time, and my family decided to take a trip to a small cabin in northern Minnesota. It was just me, my mom, and my younger brother, who was only 7 years old. We planned to stay for the entire week. Part of the reason for the trip was to explore some smaller towns in the area and see if it might be somewhere we'd want to move in the future. The cabin was one my mom found online. None of us had ever been there before, and I don't think she realized just how remote it was. It sat about 35 minutes away from the nearest town or grocery store, surrounded almost entirely by forest. The drive itself took a little over 10 hours. I drove the first few hours, then my mom took over. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky orange over endless trees. It was beautiful, a complete contrast from the city we were used to. The cabin, however, looked old. The wood creaked loudly, and everything felt slightly uneven, like it hadn't been professionally built. Still, it was a cabin, so none of us thought much of it. We unpacked, started a fire in the wood-burning fireplace, and tried to relax after the long drive. I ended up taking a nap in the evening. My mom went to bed around 8:30, and my brother went to his room shortly after. Because I had slept earlier, I wasn't tired yet, so I stayed up alone in the living room. I scrolled on my phone for a while, then decided to step outside and get some fresh air. The back porch was small, just a wooden deck with a rough-looking fire pit and a few chairs. I sat down and listened to the forest. It was incredibly quiet. No cars, no distant city noise, just wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird call. The air was colder than I expected, but it felt peaceful. I noticed a stack of logs beside the cabin and decided to light a small fire in the pit. It burned surprisingly well. I sat there for about half an hour, enjoying the silence and the warmth. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp sound echoed through the forest. It sounded heavy, almost like an axe striking wood. It only happened once, but it sounded close enough to make my stomach tighten. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, and there was no reason anyone should have been anywhere near us. The peaceful feeling disappeared instantly. My nerves started creeping up, and after a few minutes of sitting there in silence, I decided to put out the fire and go back inside. My mom and brother were already asleep. I still wasn't tired, so I stayed in the living room watching a movie on my phone. About 15 minutes in, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it might just be the cabin settling or the wind, but something about it didn't feel right. A minute later, I heard another sound, this time from the opposite side of the cabin, close to the wall beside me. There was a window there. I leaned slightly closer to listen. Before I could fully process what I was hearing, a loud series of knocks slammed against the front door. The entire cabin vibrated from the impact. I froze. My mom rushed out of her bedroom, asking what that was. I told her someone was at the door. She immediately grabbed her phone and called 911. There was absolutely no reason for someone to be pounding on a cabin door in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. While she was on the phone, I slowly stepped toward the door and looked through the peephole. It was extremely dark outside, but I could see the silhouette of a man standing just a few feet away from the door. In his hand was a large axe. My heart felt like it stopped. I tried desperately to convince myself there was some explanation. Maybe he needed help, maybe he was lost. But nothing about the situation made sense in a good way. He kept pounding on the door without saying a single word. Then came a loud crack. The blade of the axe punched slightly through the wooden door. That was enough. We ran into the farthest room in the cabin and locked ourselves inside. We could hear several more heavy impacts against the door before everything suddenly stopped. We didn't know if he had given up or if he had broken in and moved somewhere else. We just waited in silence until police finally arrived, about 15 minutes later. The front door had deep gouges carved into it, but there were no signs that the man had gotten inside. There was also no sign of where he went. The officers assumed he disappeared back into the forest. Their best guess was that the campfire I'd lit earlier had been visible from far away and attracted him toward the cabin. Why he was out there in the woods at night with an axe, and what he intended to do, remains unknown. We left the cabin immediately and didn't stay another night, and no, we never moved there.